Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. So glad you are joining us. I hope for those of you in a setting where summer feels like it's begun, that's certainly what it's like here in the South where we're at in Franklin, Tennessee. I hope you're enjoying the summer. You're getting out. You're getting engaged in creation. We just experienced our longest day of the year, right? 3 days ago. And today we're talking about something that's pretty relevant to the month of June. The month of June, as many of you know, is called Pride Month. And because of that, there's a high emphasis on the LGBTQ conversation and the conversation around culture and rights and what does it mean to live alongside neighbors and be a part of life with people who might think differently than you or believe differently or practice differently than you. And so we wanted to engage that this past year when we had our conversation in April at our Q 2021 Culture Summit. And so we wanted to talk about a topic that's come up a lot legislatively. It's been one of those agenda items. You're hearing about it more and more this month of June. And we wanted to address it by just helping you be more aware of how this policy starts to play out in American life and how this would play out in public life. And it's something called the Equality Act. Now, for those of you who aren't reading up on this, and this is maybe the first time you're hearing it, you're going to hear a great description from Kristen Waggoner, who's general counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom, describe this policy, how it's designed to work, how it functions, how it affects businesses, how it will affect Christian organizations and parachurch organizations, ministries and schools. And that's what we wanted her to do. We wanted her to create awareness so that everybody within the Christian community just understands that with this particular policy, there would be major change happening. There would be significant challenges to the way in which Christian institutions currently operate. And it would be based on a new worldview that would enter into legislation around LGBT rights. There's many that disagree with this policy. There's many outside of the Christian community who just say this is not the right way forward. This is not the best way for Americans to get along and to operate. But here at Q, we want you to be aware of all these conversations. We want you to be curious. We want to think well. We want you to have the best education on the conversations that you might have. And so I hope that over this 9-minute talk, which is quite short, it will give you an opportunity to hear a little bit more about how this is going to work if it were to come to pass. Now, certainly within our current Congress, not a lot gets passed, and it takes a long time for these conversations to move forward. So we're not sure whether this will really go forward. Alternative proposals are being discussed. In fact, at our Culture Summit, we also debated and discussed amongst two people who disagreed another policy that others are putting forward within the Christian community and others to try to find a middle road through this. And so we had a robust conversation around it, but it began with this. And so let's listen in now to Kristen Waggoner, who will speak to us about Equality Act implications.
When my friend and client, Lori, was a young woman, she was very afraid of her uncle. Her uncle was a homeless drug addict, and he lived on the streets of Seattle. And he actually died on the streets of Seattle. When Sherry decided to retire early from being a pilot at FedEx, she decided to overcome this fear. So she started volunteering at the Downtown Hope Center in Anchorage, Alaska. She now runs the place. The Downtown Hope Center actually provides about 500 meals every single day to those who live on the streets of Anchorage, Alaska. It also provides laundry services, clean clothing, job skills training, and the hope of Jesus to everyone who walks in its doors. At night, the Hope Center also provides a women's shelter. All of the women, about 50 of them who are there in the day, come at night, and they sleep in a common room. And that common room, there are about 3 feet between each of those cots that the women sleep on. Those women, nearly all of them, have in some way been touched by significant trauma, domestic violence, substance abuse, and many who have been trafficked. One night, a man came to the door of the shelter, and he was pounding on that door, belligerently demanding entrance to sleep in the shelter. He was wearing a pink women's nightgown, and he was cut across the face, and he was drunk. Sherry then came to the door, intervened. She prayed for the man. She also gave him cab fare so that he could get treatment at a hospital nearby. She then closed the door, turned around, and saw several of the women that were cowering in fear behind her, one of which said, "Had you let him in, I would be sleeping in the woods in the dark and bitter winter tonight, because I will not sleep with a man 3 feet away from me in this shelter." Sherry's decision just makes common sense, I think, to most of us. But to Anchorage officials, they actually told Sherry that she likely violated the law there. The law says that sexual orientation and gender identity are a protected class, and that she had engaged in gender identity discrimination by protecting those women that night. That's what the Equality Act would do. The so-called Equality Act has been passed by the House of Representatives, and it's in the Senate right now. And that act would force secular and faith-based women's shelters to admit men, regardless of the women's safety, privacy, or their need for safe spaces. The act overhauls civil rights laws, and it adds special protected class status for sexual orientation, and it defines those essentially on subjective feelings, perceptions, and attractions. If it passes, it would also silence and punish those who hold to the reality that there are two sexes, that those sexes are equal, very much equal, but also different and complementary, regardless of whether someone is male or female. In addition, it would also silence and punish those who hold the belief that marriage is uniquely between a husband and a wife. The law broadly imposes a national mandate for a new sexual orthodoxy. It actually expands abortion rights, and it guts religious freedom protections. Virtually everyone will be affected in some way if this law passes. Now wait, you say, I must be exaggerating. How could I possibly know this? The law hasn't passed yet. Well, I know it because similar laws have been passed at the state and local level, and ADF has defended victims of those laws for quite a while now in court battles. The laws don't just apply to women's shelters either. And as a woman, I think I can specifically speak to the issue of private spaces and what those mean to me. The women in this audience, the women that are listening, they don't want to share their private spaces with men. Not just our restrooms, but also our locker rooms. And I don't want my daughter sharing a single-sex college dorm room. And those women that have raised their hand to say, wait a minute, I have concerns about this, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, have been told that they're engaging in bigotry by expressing their concern about undressing in front of the opposite sex. Now, surely you know how these laws would also apply to sports, so I won't spend much time on that, but they deprive women of fair competition as well. Even the absolutely stunning record set by Allison Felix, she's an Olympian with 9 medals under her belt, she would be beat and bested by many of the high school boys in the country. In fact, in 1 year alone, 300 high school boys beat her time. That's why ADF clients Alana and Selena, as well as Chelsea, filed a lawsuit in Connecticut when Connecticut adopted a similar policy. And actually that policy, in 2 years, 2 biological men took 15 state championships away from girls. And over 85 times, girls were precluded from advancing to higher levels of competition. Those boys actually, at least one of them, competed for 3 years as a male and 3 weeks prior to moving into the girls' league. But the act has other consequences as well. It will force medical providers, including Christian doctors and Christian hospitals, to offer abortion and radical, irreversible gender affirmation treatment, like mastectomies and hysterectomies, to essentially masculinize women, and hormone treatment that has irreversible effects on development and function. And this will happen regardless of whether that provider has a medical concern, an ethical concern, or even the lack of effectiveness, proof of effectiveness. This affects medical health providers as well. They have one choice. They can affirm that false identity, or they can be lawbreakers. That's what the Equality Act would do. Let me give you some examples here as well. First of all, psychotherapist Dr. David Schwartz simply and kindly converses with his patients, many of whom share his Jewish faith, and they are adults who come to him saying they want to, in some cases, overcome same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria and live consistent with the beliefs of their faith. New York City passed a law that would threaten Dr. Schwartz $10,000 for every conversation he had that did that. There's also Dr. Alan Josephson. Dr. Josephson actually lost his job as the division chief at a prestigious university hospital He led the program in child and adolescent psychiatry. He advocated for watchful waiting rather than pushing radical hormone treatment on children at young ages. Consistent with the science, of course, which says that 80 to 95% of all children will actually make it through puberty and live consistent with their biological sex, even if they express gender confusion at a young age. And then there's Kira Bell. Kira Bell went to her doctor as well. She suffered, as she said, from a number of different issues, but she was presented with one treatment, and it was cross-sex hormones and surgery. So that's what happened. She explained, "I was an unhappy girl who needed help. I was treated like experiment or an experimentation." She now lives with the irreversible effects that this has taken on her body. The act would not only drive out Dr. Josephson and Dr. Schwartz, who are skilled physicians who love God and love people, but it would also preclude doctors and parents from making decisions that are in the best interest of children. It would actually require them to affirm the perceived gender and wouldn't allow support for people like Kira who want to live again consistent with their true sex. The act also has an effect on children longing for a forever home. We know in other states where policies have been passed that are actually making parents ineligible to foster or adopt if they don't embrace radical gender identity ideology. And we've seen states actually exclude religious faith-based foster care and adoption agencies like New Hope Family Adoption Services, who place vulnerable children in homes. That denies birth moms the option of being able to find homes with moms and dads who share their Christian beliefs. We also know that these laws affect business owners in a profound way, including creative professionals. Phoenix, for example, passed a law similar to the so-called Equality Act, and that law actually would put Joanna and Brianna in jail if they declined to use their calligraphy and hand painting skills to create art that violated their convictions. And of course, you heard Gabe talk about Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop at the beginning of this. I had the privilege of arguing Jack's case, but I suspect you haven't heard the true facts about that case, which is that Jack serves everyone that walks in his shop, everyone. But he has never, in 27 years, designed every cake that violates his convictions. When he was asked to design a custom cake for a same-sex wedding, he offered the couple anything else in his shop and offered to design custom cakes for other occasions, but said, "I just can't express a message that violates my convictions." That hauled him up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while he won at the U.S. Supreme Court, the court's decision was based on the fact that Colorado had made disparaging and hostile statements about Jack's faith and applied a double standard to him. But again, the Equality Act would have a profound impact on Jack. 3 weeks after the United States Supreme Court decision, Jack found himself hauled in again to another legal matter because a transgender activist attorney called him and requested a cake that was blue on the outside, pink on the inside to celebrate his transition. The attorney then called again and requested a cake that would celebrate Satan, with Satan on the top smoking a marijuana joint. Of course, he knew Jack would decline those cakes, and he did. We just finished Jack's trial about 3 weeks ago. He's been litigating for 9 years now. This kind of harassment is what the Equality Act would put forth, and it would force artists like Jack to promote messages that violate their convictions. And make no mistake, I'm not here to tell you whether you ought to design that cake. That's up to you. What I am here to tell you is that the Equality Act would decide that issue for you, and it would take away your freedom. It would take away all of our freedoms. Even if we disagree, the government shouldn't have that kind of power. Lastly, the act would threaten the freedom of private religious institutions, universities, schools, K through 12, faith-based organizations of all different kinds, and even churches. It even would deny students the right to federal financial aid if they wanted to attend a school. And it would likely force those schools to change their standards of conduct, their admissions policies, and even what they're teaching in the classroom. The Equality Act imposes ideological purity as the price to enter the marketplace, the public square, and even polite society. Now, as Christians, what do? Well, first, we treat all people with respect and dignity. We honor them as being created in God's image. But that is not what this act does. We are called to love God and our neighbor. But because of that call, we cannot support elevating the vague categories of sexual orientation and gender identity into protected class status in the law. Because they're not only unbiblical, they are harmful to the conception of the human person. As Archbishop Chaput has said, our commitment to charity and justice are not an excuse for compromising with grave evil. So I would challenge us that I think we instead should follow the examples of Nehemiah, of Esther, of Joseph, and of so many others, of Daniel, those who stood for the truth, who didn't compromise on that truth, and actually, in hostile cultures and uncertain times, moved a generation. We do need to vote, of course, that matters. We do need to engage in relationships like you heard about earlier. And as a part of those relationships, we also need to speak and to act winsomely, bravely, and compassionately, to talk about why God's created order promotes the human good. We need to have those conversations with our coworkers, with our neighbors, with our friends, and most of all, with our kids. Because who knows what God can do if we do? If we do just that, he might help us raise up the next generation in faith, in truth, and hopefully in a free nation.
Well, I know that was a lot to take in, and I hope you're able to get your head around some of what Kristen here is describing of really a whole new way of interaction. I thought her quote where she says, the Equality Act imposes ideological purity as the price to enter the marketplace, the public square, and even polite society is a good way of putting it, that this type of policy would indeed do that. And it's something we just have to be very aware of. There needs to be alternatives. There needs to be a way that we can all get along. And as you know, in public policy, and you think about politics, no policy is perfect. They're imperfect policies to try to create human flourishing. And so these are debatable. These are moral issues. These are discussions that we must have. And I hope this helps begin that conversation for you. And I want to encourage you, if you want to hear more about not only this conversation, but the follow-up 18 minutes that we had a discussion around alternatives to the Equality Act, go to media.qideas.org/trial. That's media.qideas.org/trial. And fill out your information, and you'll get a 30-day free trial where you can go onto Q Media and you can watch not only this talk, but the conversation around the Equality Act. And you can also hear all of the other many talks that we had at our Q Ideas event. And so I'd encourage you to be a part of the Q Media community, get involved. It's a great way to learn, to have conversations this summer with those you love about so many of these important issues where it's pretty difficult to find this kind of conversation happening anywhere. And finally, I just want to thank Kristen Waggoner and Alliance Defending Freedom for helping us think through this issue well. And certainly, if you're interested in learning more about the Equality Act or Alliance Defending Freedom's work on this and this piece of legislation, they've created a great resource for you at adflegal.org/Equality Act. So go there and check that out, learn more about it as you're having engaged, smart, thoughtful conversations. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of the month of June and a great July 4th.